My name is Father John Perich. I'm the curator of the Metropolitan Museum of the Orthodox Church in America, and I would like to welcome you today on a tour of the museum. You have entered into the vestibule of the Metropolitan Museum, in which is housed not only the collection of the monastery of St. Tikhon of Zadonsk, which was founded in 1905, but also the John and Lucille Guzzi collection, icon repository, and Russian antiquities, as well as several other individual collections, including some of the most prized items of Metropolitan Theodosius and Metropolitan Herman. As we come inside to the museum, we are greeted with the icon of the Feodorovskaya Mother of God. This icon, which is from the John and Lucille Guzzi icon collection, is the original from Tsarskoye Selo, the palace of the Ekaterinsky Palace in which the imperial family lived prior to their exile to Ekaterinburg. And this icon, as you can see, has an altered riza. It was probably altered several times since it left Russia after the revolution. However, it is the original and the last icon in Tsarskoye Selo that the children of the Tsar and the family together prayed before their exile, where they met their untimely death. Let us proceed into the main part of the monastery and Metropolitan Museum collection. As you can see before you is an exhibition of Christian education for the children of the church in America. What we have featured here are the various cupolas of the most historic churches of America, including the tower of St. Michael's Cathedral in Sitka, the tower of the Wilkes-Barre Cathedral of the Holy Resurrection, Holy Trinity Cathedral in in San Francisco, and also Holy Trinity Cathedral in Chicago. These are made of cardboard, but they show the actual historical evolution of the church from the West Coast, from Alaska originally, through San Francisco to Chicago, and from Chicago to the East Coast. We will then now proceed with the actual displays which make up the tour of this museum. You see here before you what is emblematic of the arrival of immigrants to Ellis Island. This represents the items, and many of them are the originals, that families brought to the coast of the United States on their immigration from not only Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, but also the Middle East. This is basically a collection of personal items that we have been able to amass here at the monastery to show the immigrant experience to America, the bringing of Orthodox items and their Orthodox heritage and faith. However, very few know that when they arrived in America, there was already an indigenous Orthodox church already here, made up of many Native Americans, many of the tribes of Alaska, including the Athabascan Indians, the Tlinkits along the coastal areas, the Yupik Eskimo, and the Aleuts from the Aleutian chain. This is indicative of their various cultures and of the adoption of the Orthodox faith by those people and their ancestors. In the center you see these little houses. These are spirit houses that are used by the Dena'ina Athabascan Indians in the Kenai area, the Kenai Peninsula area, going all the way up to Copper River. It was their idea that when a person was buried, they were told to have a 40th day service, and they were explained by the missionaries the importance of a 40th day service for the soul. And they often said, we bury the body in the ground, we place the blanket of the tribe on top of the body, and then on the 40th day they decided to bring a house, and they were questioned as to why. Well, they combined an old Indian tradition of spirit houses, and they felt this spirit house would be the place for the soul to reside in the interim period. And this is why you see these various colors on top represent the different tribes. You also have items from the Tlinkits, as well as the arrival of the first missionaries from Valam Monastery in 1794. This is the indicative of that. As you can see, there were 8 monks totally, including St. Herman of Alaska, who arrived on Kodiak Island after departing from St. Petersburg and the Valam Monastery with the blessing of Metropolitan Gabriel of St. Petersburg in 1793. They arrived in Kodiak Island September 24th, 1794. And this is where the first liturgy was celebrated in their new monastic and first monastic community in America. And these paintings were actually taken from line drawings and turned into paintings so that we could have a better idea and conception of what the original monastic endeavor was here in the United States. This, of course, represents the grave and the body of St. Herman in its grave in the chapel of St. Sergius and Herman of Valam, which is located on Spruce Island. We've also placed here a very interesting line drawing of one of the first services in Fort Ross in California. As you know, northern part of California was also part of the Russian colony. And the Indians that you see here in this line drawing are not, there's some Aleuts and some Creoles, but there are also Pomo Indians and Kashtan Indians who come from tribes that were converted to Christianity in the northern part of California at the time of the arrival of this Russian mission. This here ontiments is very unusual. It's the first ontiments that came with the Valam mission. It is dated in 1793. It was signed during the period of the Empress Catherine, and also, as you can see, it was hand-signed by Metropolitan Gabriel, who was the Metropolitan in charge of giving the ontiments and ecclesiastical items for the first missionaries who came from Valam. Inside is still the original relics of this, and it is signed in several places by Metropolitan Gabriel. We now process to what was the Russian bishop's home. As you can see, this is how it looks today. This was the home built by Saint Innocent of Alaska. And as you can see, this is the Russian bishop's house. And here we have the wife of the last governor of Alaska, the Russian Alaska. This is Princess Aglaida Maksutov. Her husband, Prince Maksutov, was the last Russian governor of Alaska before the sale in 1867. And here you also have sitting at his desk is Bishop Peter Lysakov, Bishop of Sitka, at the same time in 1867. As you can see, this is a typical, of course, like a governor's mansion, but this was the bishop's house. This home was lived in even by Metropolitan Theodosius when he was first appointed the Bishop of Sitka in 1967. Here were the quarters of the bishops on this side of the home. Here was the chapel dedicated to the Annunciation of the Mother of God. Here you have the portico, and downstairs here on the first level is where you had the original Sitka Seminary and Sitka Religious School for the Tlinkits and for the Aleuts who would attend classes here. As time went on, the building was becoming somewhat deteriorated in the back end here, and the United States Department of Interior restored the building back to its pristine condition and state as if it was in 1840. The next scene on our tour is that of a typical Carpatho-Russian priest family, either from the Carpathian Mountains or Galicia. As you know, many of the immigrants who came to the church here in America initially in the late 1800s came from these sections outside of the Russian Empire, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you'll see a typical priest with his matushka and his children at Easter time, at Pascha. And as you can see, the items are typical of the Carpathian people who actually formed the majority of adherents of the Orthodox Church in America back in the 1800s and early 1900s. As you can see here, we now begin the collection of artifacts of the original monastery and our church in America. You have many of the icons from the old monastery and from several of our old parishes, but important items, again, from our church, as well as items from the John and Lucille Guzzi collection. As you can see, the very unusual icons. This is a susalka icon. Susalka means it's painted on gold leaf, and then with hot needles, they make design work on top of the gold leaf. Now, this icon has not been restored in any way, shape, or form, and it is from the 19th century. It is of St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker. In this scene, which we now proceed to, we have the original desk of St. Nikolai Velimirovich of Zhitcha. He came here following the Second World War, where he was incarcerated in Dachau by the Germans, but he came here to be a teacher, a professor at St. Tikhon's Seminary, and later became the rector. This is his original desk and items from his room. For example, you have one of his little vases that he had, his skufia. You'll see pictures of him in the old monastery church as it looked in those days. And if you look closely here, you'll see behind him the icon of the Mother of God from the iconostas. That same icon is right here, as well as the icon of Christ. These are the originals from the old iconostas of the old monastery. His amaphor, his small amaphor, as well as various other items from his room. He died here, and of course he was buried in Libertyville at the monastery of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and I understand since then that his body was taken back to his home in Serbia. We now proceed to some of the most unusual and original items from the old monastery church. Some of the kadilas, some of the lampadas, hand blessing crosses, the paten, icons, many old pictures of the monastic community in its early days, as well as some valuable icons that were given through the generosity of the Guzzi family. This troitsa, which was used here in the monastery, was hand-carved by a boy who used to study here in the early days, around 1914, 1915, in the old pedagogical school that prepared them to enter St. Platon's Seminary in Tenafly, New Jersey. Here we have, in this case, some very unusual original Fabergé Ovchinnikov pieces. You have a kosh, a very beautiful kosh, studded with about 100 carats of cabochon stones, done in the shaded enamel style, as well as a water, three-pronged water goblet, studded with amethyst, carnelians, sapphires, and rubies. These are very valuable. They're sterling and gold, 14 to 18 carats in some places, but they are original pieces, and they belong to our collection from John and Lucille Guzzi. Here you have one of our former bishops of Alaska, His Eminence Archbishop Gregory, who fell asleep in the Lord in 2008. What's interesting about Archbishop Gregory, this is his original mantya and his panagia and his other items, was that his grandfather, as you can see here depicted in a book about him from Russia, has become a saint of the Orthodox Church in Russia. He was one of the last functioning priests in Kiev at the time of the Stalin period in World War II, and he has been canonized along with those martyrs, new martyrs of Russia, with the name Michael of Kiev. Now here in this case, as well as several other cases, you will see many of the icons that the monastery possesses all the way back to the 15th century. Some of these are on loan, others belong to the monastery collection as well as the collection of the Orthodox Church in America. This unusual icon in silver, this Riza, is of Saint Nicholas, the wonder worker. You have many others, Saint John the Baptist, you have a deicess, you have various other saints featured, including Christ enthroned, a hand-embroidered icon of Saint Nicholas, a hand-embroidered icon of the resurrection of Christ, as well as others studded with Siberian topaz and various forms of Russian enameling. This set of vestments is one of the original worn by some of the early missionary priests. This belonged to Father Dankiewicz, who used to be the priest in Holy Trinity Church in New Britain, Connecticut. And as you can see, it's magnificently spun in gold and silver bullion. It is the chrysanthemum pattern. But as you can see here in this icon that's embroidered and tufted, it's extremely beautifully done. And this you could touch. You could feel the metallic inside the actual gold bullion. This has not been in any way, shape, or form altered or even treated, and that's its original state. Here you have some of our chalices of the monastery. This is a 16th century, 17th century, and an 18th century chalice in silver and gold. The outside are enamels. This is en plan style, and this is enamel Rostov style. As you can see, they're in magnificent condition. This is shaded enamel. This is typically Russian enamel, and this is a silver repoussé. And these chalices are still used on various holidays and on special occasions within the monastery church. Again, here we have very, very beautiful items from the old monastery from 1905, 1906, 1907. The original monastery chalice covers, the monastery troitsa for Pascha, hand blessing crosses, one of the original altar gospels from Galicia from the 19th century, baptismal kits, kropillas, all of which are indigenous to the monastery community in its early days. In this scene, we have one of our gospels. We have a large number of gospels in silver and in gold. Some of them, the oldest one, dating back to 1636. It is the original Romanov gospel, the gospel that was used for the election and enthronization of the first Romanov Tsar, Michael I. These are vestments of one of our graduates of our seminary. He later became the first bishop of Washington, D.C. His name was Jonah Stolberg, and these are one of his original sets. Again, I pointed out, these are from our collection of icons. As you can see, we have many hand-beaded icons. These are with river pearls and seed pearls, and they have all been probably made in monasteries, most likely women monasteries in Russia, where it was a very popular art. They also are the ones who used to make with their hands the plashchanitsas and various other tapestries for the church. So these icons are indicative of that time and that period. Here we have the mantya of one of our early rectors, Archbishop Nikon de Grieve, who came from St. Sergius in Paris, the Institute, and eventually became the rector of St. Tikhon's Seminary. He was, before his falling asleep, the Archbishop of Brooklyn. Okay. There are also some more of our gospel collection. This one gospel in the center is dated June 22nd, 1898, and belonged to the Bishop of Kaluga. This book of Psalms, like a psalter, which is all hand-bound in leather and handwritten, by the way, is from the 1500s and belonged to one of the ancient monasteries in Russia. In this case, we have the history of the musicians, the professors of music of the church. It's interesting to note that when missionaries were sent to America in the early days, they were often accompanied by paid choir directors or psalmodstiks or teachers who would come to the parishes with the newly assigned missionary priest to teach the children as well as the adults not only the art of singing, but how to sing properly in church, and also to be instructed in the law of God, Zakon Boży. So, for example, this talks and speaks to us, the future generations of the church, as to what transpired. Who were some of these famous choir directors? Well, there were the Zaitchenkos, the Gorokhovs, the Grecheninovs, the Afonskis, the Mashichins, the Pogrebniaks, the Hilkos, the Resitars, the Yermakovs, and all the way down the line through Professor David Drilak, Father Glagoyev's father, and many others. The Soroka family, of course, of Pittsburgh. Great musicians, the entire family. Baradulia from the old Jersey City parish of St. Peter and Paul, and then later his son at the Cathedral of St. Nicholas in Washington, D.C. All of these families, many of them families filled with musicians and composers and choir directors, helped the evolution and development of our own church music here in America. So this is a very important aspect of this exhibition. Here you see in this column some of the original mitres of our archpriests and some of our monastic archimandrites. In the center here, the red one, belonged to St. Nicholas of Życia. The top one, Father Archpriest Peter Kreder, who was from the Pittsburgh area. The father of Father Joseph Kreder, who used to be the Chancellor of Alaska. The second belonged to Father John Squeer, of fame from the days of the Tomos, when he helped in the negotiations concerning the Tomos of autocephaly. But this mitre did not belong to him initially. It actually belonged to Archbishop Dmitry Magan, who was the Archbishop and Bishop of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And you can see his patron saint of Dmitry right in the front here. And this is from Father Paul Zlatkovsky, who was a missionary priest who came also from Australia after the war and worked in Connecticut in the New Haven Holy Transfiguration Parish. In this wall, and in this case, again, some of the most beautiful icons of our collection. You have Manea icons, and then you have the icon of all the feasts concerning Christ. And this is a typical Manea icon from the month of July. And of course, various others. That icon of the Pokrov, the protection of the Mother of God, which feast day is on October 1st. And this is one of our most prized possessions. This is the icon of the protection of the Mother of God. But it's a very unusual one, since the icon itself is about 200 years older than the Riza itself. And the workmanship is magnificent. A Riza means vestments. An aklad, the word, means a covering. So actually you would call this an aklad, but it's often referred to as a riza because it's a vestment, a covering for the saint's garb. Here we have, again, some of the more important gospels of the monastery collection, as well as the original airs. Now, why would I put airs in this collection? Well, they're very important, because they show a different medium of iconography. These are all hand embroidered and hand stitched, and as you can see, the angels are holding the fans over Christ who lays in the chalice. And this is one of the original airs of our monastery church, as well as the cross of Golgotha with the spear and the sponge. And here we have some very unusual Greek icons. We have several Greek icons that predate the invasion of and fall of Constantinople in 1453. This case is double in the sense that we have a gospel from the 1700s. This is pure silver, by the way, and gilded gold. But above here is probably one of the most fascinating monastics of our monastery. This is items from Archimandrite Vasily Filippov, who came in 1930 to this monastery. He was the kaznache, the cashier of our cathedral in Chicago. And at that time, a bishop from Alaska who was quite ill, Amphilochi, came to the monastery to live, and they needed someone to take care of him. So Father Vasily was asked, since he was a single man, he was not a member of the clergy, nor was he a monastic, if he would come to St. Tikhon's to care for this aged and infirm bishop, of which he agreed. Within a year and a half to 2 years after he arrived, he eventually became a Rasifor monk and eventually a deacon of the church. And as you can see him here in his later days before the old church, but this is his mitre. And of course, this would be his patron, Saint Basil. This is an original Fabergé icon, by the way. But what's interesting about him that you have to understand is that when he would serve as deacon, he is the first monastic on these grounds to take a litany in English. Father Shambura and Father Varsanofi, it was that evening service, all-night vigil, when Father Varsanofi was officiating the service, and Father Vasily, being the younger and the deacon, decided, instead of taking again and again in Peace in Slavonic, took it in English. Immediately he angered the older monastic, who was taken back by this. But from that point on, it became common custom for the monastics to take certain litanies during the services in the English language. Here we have a wall, a profusion of Manet icons, feast day icons, and vestments of some of our hierarchs throughout the past. We also have two very unusual Arab or Syrian icons written in Arabic, as well as items on this side of hagiographies of various saints, and again, hand embroidered and seed pearl icons of the Mother of God. This also is very unusual. It's the only canonically accepted three-dimensional icon. It's Nil Sorsky. And as you can see, if you went on a pilgrimage to his monastery in the early days in the old Russian Empire, many of these were given as gifts of your pilgrimage. So it's considered an acceptable form of iconography that we have here. This case has the original gospel of the Romanov imperial family, and we also have the Gospel of Saint Innocent of Alaska, which is there. This bottom section commemorates World War II and the plight of Orthodox Christians during World War II. You know, many of the Russians were captured as prisoners of war by the Germans, but they also kept their faith going within the camps by making and developing their own chalices out of whatever metals they could get, and also crosses and vestments. These are original items, and this icon is especially of interest. It commemorates the forcing of the former Russian Soviet troops of General Vlasov back to the Soviet Union. This picture commemorates that exact moment that when they were told they were going to be placed in trucks and returned to Russia, they decided and asked the English, who were guarding them, if they could serve their own funeral service, their own burial service. And they were given this permission. As you can see, they're serving their own panichida. And this icon is the only icon from that scene that was found in a garbage heap by a young boy who had escaped the actual forced repatriation of the people by running into the hills. And when he came back down, the people were all gone. They were already on their way back to Russia, many of which were never heard of again. He took this icon out of the garbage heap and brought it to America and gave it to us as a remembrance of this most terrible and devastating incident in the history of the Orthodox people in Europe. Again, as you can see, there's some very beautiful items, but very primitive because of the fact they didn't have the materials to create beautiful and exquisite pieces. But these not only sufficed, they were what kept the Orthodox faith alive during this 5 or 6 year period in Europe. Here you see the original mitre of St. Nicholas of Życia. This mitre was his most favorite and used on most occasions when he served here within the monastery church. It's a very beautiful mitre, but the icons are painted on actual gold. Again, more mitres of some of our famous bishops and priests, Father Manchuk, my grandfather, Father Pishte. This one belonged to Arseni, Archbishop Arseni, of blessed memory, as well as other icons from the Guzi collection. Here we have the original wedding crowns of the Dormition Church. There was a beautiful church, a second church on the grounds here at the monastery, which was built as a summer church. It started in 1915 when the monastics decided, according to tradition, that weddings and those things were not held usually in the monastic church. Those services were usually to be held in a church that was separate from the private chapel or church of the monks. So they built what they called a summer church, dedicated it to those who gave their lives in the World War I, and they dedicated it to the falling asleep of the Mother of God. It was on the hill outside on the right-hand side of the lake, in the back, behind in the woods, and it was built from lumber from the forest here, and the foundation was built from rock and ledge rock that was found way inside the forest. It was built by the monks themselves, and it was a very unusual church in that it was octagonal in structure. The cross on top, which was seen for miles around, was of Czechoslovakian crystal. It was very unusual, as well as the stained glass was mostly embedded with pieces of shiny Czech crystal, so that when you looked at the church from a distance, it sparkled. Well, unfortunately, back in the late 20s, the church was burned to the ground, and everything was lost except some of the pieces that were able to be pulled out, like these wedding crowns, pieces of the original crystal cross, some of the stained glass, but everything else was lost. And it was never rebuilt thereafter on the grounds. But there is a memory that in 1978, when I was a student here, we went looking to find where we could see if the church, anything existed, and we could not. But we remember there was a wall between the lake and the mountain, the hill. And there, lo and behold, on that wall, face down, is the actual cornerstone that we found, which tells us that this church was dedicated to the falling asleep of the Mother of God. And in here we found a capsulated little sort of a cylinder in which we found a newspaper from the period, a Russian coin, a Russian monetary note, and several other items from the original monastery, from the monks, that they put in here sort of like a time capsule. So we have this, thank God, as a reminder that the church not only existed, but that it was a dedicated church to the Mother of God. Here you see the mannequin in which the vestments of the blessed Arseni, the first monastic of our community, as well as his original jezl that he was given by Saint Perich Tikhon when he became the first abbot, and his mantia. Arseni was known as the evangelizer of Canada, because for many years after he became a monastic, he was then reassigned when he became a bishop to Canada to help with the evangelization of the Carpatho-Russian, Ukrainian, Bukovinian communities of Canada to Orthodoxy. And as you can see here, he then returned in the late 30s, around 39, to come to St. Tikhon's monastery to retire. And it was here that he fell asleep in the Lord. And these are some of his items that we still have here. This, of course, is the chalice of St. Innocent of America, the original, when he was Bishop of Alaska, as well as his panagia, his Xian cup, and his poyuchi, or his cuffs from his vestments. This is all that we have, as well as the icon with his moshchi, or relics, with inside it. But this is the chalice, and it is dated, if I'm not mistaken, around 1841. But it is his, and it was the one used by him when he was the bishop of the Aleutian chain and Alaska. In these cubicles on both sides, we have, again, many icons in various traditions, in various mediums. For example, seed pearls. You have a Coptic icon here. You have an Old Believer style icon here, as well as others in silver and gold and gilt, as well as Old Believer icons on this side. This shows you the expanse of the type of iconography that existed in the church, that found its way here to America, and various ways of portraying an icon. For example, these are embroidered icons, cuffs, all types of things. It's important that we know that not only are our icons written, but they are also embroidered. They are also made with various other crafts, as well as beading. These are the original vestments of St. Nicholas of Życia. This was his gold lame set. And as you can see here, this icon of him with the embedded relics was very unusual. It was made shortly upon his falling asleep and was given to us in 1979. And as you can see, it's him with his very bright red vestments, of which we have no idea where they went. Maybe these are the sets he was buried in, we have no idea. But as you can see, we have the red mitre, which is over there. And this set of gold lame he would only wear at either Pascha or Christmas. In this case, we have the original patriarchal mantilla of Saint Patriarch Tikhon. As you know, he was elected patriarch in 1917 in the Kremlin at the All-Russian Council, while the Kremlin was being bombarded by the Bolsheviks or the communists. What's interesting is that when he was elected, they had not prepared a mantilla, so this mantilla, probably an old one at that time, was sent from the Troitsky Sergeyev Monastery in Sergeyev Posad, and as you can see, it has Saint Sergius of Radonezh, and you have here also Nikon of Radonezh. So you have this probably from the original collection at that time of the monastery, but it was used for his enthronization in Uspensky Sobor in 1917. Also this icon of his, a panagia, as well as his moshchi, or his relics. And this is an invaluable piece. It was given to us through Archbishop John of blessed memory of Chicago, who fell asleep in the Lord, who hand-carried it during the war, the Second World War, here to the United States. As we process through the middle of this collection, you will see items from the life and original items of St. Alexis Toft. Here is his original Ipetrahil, as well as his awards from the Tsar himself, his kropila, his family ring, since he was of a noble family from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Toth family, his family crest, as well as his awards, his spoon that he received from Nicholas II on the 25th anniversary of his ordination to the priesthood, as well as a handwritten letter by him with his pechat, or family seal, that he used to use on all his correspondence in wax. We're very gifted to have these in our possession, as well as his relics. And there you see him when he was a priest here in America, a mitred archpriest. These are other items and relics of St. Herman of Alaska, the first saint of the church here in America, from Kodiak and Spruce Island. Here we have many icons with relics of saints, Saint Tryphon, Saint Brian Chaninov, Ignatiy Brian Chaninov, Saint Varvara, Saint Barbara the Great, Saint Silouan of Mount Athos, Saint Sergius of Radonezh, and Saint Daniel of Moscow. As you look this way, you see the archway here, which will go from the other side. You're looking up as if there's a service being celebrated. And you have the Metropolitan accompanied by the other bishops, archbishops, and high-ranking priests. On this side, it's the vestments of Father Vasily, and on this side, the vestments of my grandfather with their mitres. This is the married clergy, this is the monastic, and as you can see, this is as if a liturgy is being celebrated. This was done specifically to show the importance and the transition as you come in here of the fact that this is not just a museum. Rather, it is a repository, a place to keep the items that are going to be used for future. For example, on all the feast days of these icons, they are taken into the monastery church for veneration. This is important for us to know that this is not a museum of just things that sit around and people look at them. Rather, they are still used within the church for their various holidays and holy days. Here you see the original gospel, handwritten and printed in Fox Island Aleut. These here are the notes of St. Innocent with his own handwriting concerning items from the gospel that he would be using for his sermons. And you can see here this is in the Slavonic alphabet, but the language and dialect is Fox Island Aleut. And this here is an icon made by the natives in porcupine quills and seaweed from the Aleutian chain of St. Innocent, who brought many of these people and their ancestors to the Orthodox Christian faith. Now we will proceed to a very unusual display of the closest we have of some of the original monks and their stories. These are their chotki, their prayer beads, and various other items of some of our earliest monastics, including Father Naum Sepyuk, who lived to an old age of over 100 here at the monastery. Some of their boxes with the anointing brushes, and you even have here a wood clacker that was used to call people to services during Great Lent rather than using bells. And various other pictures of the monastic brotherhood. Hierodeacon at that time, Chupik, also one of the local boys who became a monastic here, as well as others, Varsanofi, Nikolai Shambura, you have, of course, Father Vasily, and many others who have lived on these grounds and have been a part of the St. Tikhon's Brotherhood from its inception. Here you have the female monastery represented by the cloak, the original cloak of Mother Alexandra. She was of the Habsburg family from Romanian nobility, and she founded the Holy Transfiguration Women's Monastery in Elwood City. And this is her original cloak that she wore that we have here in our monastery collection. Here is a memorial to the Blessed Leonti, Metropolitan of the Church in America. He was originally a married priest. He and his brother came to America as missionaries. His brother was Father Benediktovich. And they not only worked as missionaries, they were also professors at our seminaries, whether it be in Minneapolis or in St. Platon's in Tenafly, and they became part of the church. And then, of course, unfortunately, his Matushka fell asleep in the Lord, and for the sake of the church, he accepted to be the Bishop of Chicago, from which he was later elected as Metropolitan of our church upon the falling asleep of Metropolitan Theophilus Pashkovsky. So this is his history, and these are some of his original pieces. Here is in mannequins, is a panorama of all the original vestments of some of our former metropolitans of our church in America. Metropolitan Platon, Metropolitan Theophilus Paszkowski, Metropolitan Leonti Terkevich. He was very famous for wearing his white punji-style riasa. Metropolitan Irénée Békés, and on him is the original riasa that he was given by the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, following his installation as the Bishop of Tokyo, following World War II. And this was a gift, and later he gave it to my grandfather, so I've returned it now to the church to be used here. But that originally was his. Metropolitan Theodosius and Metropolitan Herman. And as you can see, I have many of the original pieces. This was Metropolitan Platon's Panagia that was given on a Memorial Day pilgrimage in 1912 by the faithful of the church on an anniversary that he was celebrating for being a missionary to America. And the inscription says, "To the great missionary of the church in America, Platon," and given by the priests and the lay people at that time. Here in this scene, we also want to show the history of the people in America and their traditions that they brought from Europe. In this case, it's a traditional Carpathia-Russian celebration of Velia, or Holy Supper. As you can see, the various items and the food that they would use, the Lenten food, and the type of home that they would have, and the costumes and the like. But it's very important that we see that there was an immigrant experience, and from this immigrant experience grew the traditions that we still have now in the American church. In this scene, which is very unusual, but we wanted to include it in the collection, we wanted to depict the evangelist Luke painting or writing the first icon of the Mother of God. It was very hard to portray this scene because you have to imagine that this is how we believe that the icons of the Mother of God came about, through Saint Luke the Evangelist. So as you can see here, this represents the evangelist, and this represents the Mother of God. And he is writing an icon inspired by her at that time in a typical home, in his position not only as a writer of the Gospel of Luke, as you can see here, opened up in this old Gospel, and parchments and manuscripts, but also as the one who began the tradition of writing icons of the Virgin Mary and of Christ. It's a very unusual exhibition in this sense, but it does put the point across that the iconography of our church was divinely inspired. Here we have the scene of the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in America. We celebrate this because we are an autocephalous church in America, and these are the main individuals who were involved in the negotiations and the culmination of our church's independence, our church's autocephaly from our mother church in Moscow. As you can see, Metropolitan Nicodim, who represented at that time the Patriarch of Moscow, Archbishop Cyprian, who was the lead of our own negotiating team, my grandfather, Father Pishte, Father Alexander Schmemann, Father John Meyendorf, and Father John Squeer, all of which attended the three main important meetings. One was held in New York, there was another one held in Tokyo, Japan, and the third one was held in Geneva, Switzerland, which brought about the Tomos of Autocephaly, the actual signing and points of the Tomos of Autocephaly, and the proclamation of the Orthodox Church in America at its first Sabor that was held here on the monastery grounds, when my grandfather read the Tomos in English, Father Schmemann read the Tomos in Russian, and we had the proclamation of the Autocephalous Church in America right on these sacred grounds. Well, basically, that concludes the tour of our monastery. You can see here that the church has progressed over the years. This is our original chaplain, all the way up to the present day. It was important to note that Father Vladimir Berechevsky was one of our first chaplains in the military, as well as Father Michael Kovac. Now we have, of course, Father Bobak, and this is the late Chief of Military Chaplains, Father Gregory Pelish, Father Alexander from the Antiochian Church, and of course our own Father Telencio, who was one of the orphans of our St. Tikhon's Monastery orphanage. And as you can see here, they are in battle gear, and also, of course, Father Basil Stroyan, his flag, and we have many other items from these very, very important men who served our armed forces all the way through from the beginning of World War II. Yes, we will conclude our tour now under this beautiful replica of the original arch of St. Tikhon's Monastery. Wherever you go throughout the world, if you see this, you are in St. Tikhon's Monastery, and this is historically what represents our monastery. And here we have one of the recent additions to our collection. It came from Father Michael Romanchak. It is a beautiful icon of the Blakhnirskaya Mother of God. This is the icon of the Akaphist hymn. It is the icon, most likely, that belonged to one of the aristocratic families, either the Golitsins or the Narishkin family from Russia. And it was an icon, of course, that was used during the 5th week of Great Lent. But what's important is, as we conclude our tour, is that you understand that this monastery, these sacred grounds, not only was founded by a saint, Saint Perich Tikhon, but many saints walked on these grounds and lived on these grounds, including Saint Nikolai of Zhitcha, Father Alexander Khatevitsky, Father John Kachurov, Archbishop or Bishop Raphael Hawawini, who blessed the original monastery celebration in 1905, and many others, and I'm sure many others that have not even been glorified as saints in the church, and hopefully with God's help they will be. But what's important is that throughout the generations, the faithful of the church in America have always considered these grounds to be sacred. And throughout our history, this monastery is representative of the history of our church in America. It has been here as the first monastery in America with a long tradition of the love of God and prayers before the throne of Almighty God. The constant prayer that is still continued to this day by the monastic community led by Father Sergius and his monastic brothers is very important for the life and the future of our church here in America. And I thank you very much. You're always welcome to come to visit us, to see this beautiful monastery and Orthodox Church museum, as well as the repository of John and Lucille Guzzi. God bless you, and thank you very much for your kind attention.